I do not want to hold you long. I have learned to survive in ministry this long that whether or not there is chicken waiting after a service, I have learned that indeed it is good to always at least pretend that there is. That way I may proceed with the matter at hand of conveying the gospel and then allowing the people of God to go forth. Amen? Amen. And so during such an auspicious and wonderful occasion as this, in which we commemorate the life of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it is absolutely understandable and expected that we focus primarily upon his life and his legacy. But I have often found that in order to truly understand someone, you must also understand who influenced that person. Those who are influential have also themselves been influenced. And it is well known to most of us that Dr. King was in the company of many great leaders, whether it be Reverend Ralph Abernathy or Reverend Andrew Young or Reverend Jesse Jackson or the late but forever great Representative John Lewis. And likewise, he was in the company of Dr. Gardner C. Taylor and Dr. Sandy F. Ray. And these types of influences are influences from which he benefited. And it is one thing to praise someone for their accomplishments, but we should never fail to praise those who influenced that person, for they are beneficiaries of that influence. Amen. As we are all beneficiaries of someone else's influence, someone else's efforts, someone else's sacrifices, someone else's work. 5 years before I was born, in 1977, in 1972, Reverend Jesse Jackson appeared on none other than Sesame Street. And it was there that he recited a poem for which he would become very famous. But to his credit, Reverend Jackson never took credit for this particular poem, even though he is synonymous with this poem. Reverend Jackson, while on Sesame Street, simply spoke the words, I may have made some mistakes, but I am somebody. My clothes are different, my face is different, my hair is different, but I am somebody. I am black, brown, or white. I speak a different language, but I must be respected, protected, and never neglected or rejected because I am somebody. And to his credit, again, Reverend Jackson never took credit for being the author of this poem because he, in fact, is not the author of this poem. He adapted it, but he is not the author. And so, as Dr. Benjamin Franklin famously said, originality is the ability to hide your sources. Thankfully, Reverend Jackson chose not to be original, but instead to give credit where credit was due. And being someone who's interested in deconstructing the origin of things, I wanted to know exactly from whom did Reverend Jackson first hear this poem. And so I began working backwards and understanding that Reverend Jackson was active on the south side of Chicago, a place where God blessed me to do ministry for a certain amount of time in my life. And that Reverend Jackson led what was called Operation Breadbasket. And there were a number of different types of activists and revolutionaries who were active on the south side at that time. And a common refrain that could be heard on the south side and the west side of Chicago was, I am a revolutionary. And I began to think, perhaps did Reverend Jackson hear that and adapt that? But then I realized that one would have to go all the way back to 1943. February 20th, 1943, in fact, in which there was a friend of Martin Luther King Sr. by the name of the Reverend Dr. William Holmes Borders Sr., who was the pastor of Wheat Street Baptist Church, which neighbored Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And Dr. Borders, in addition to being an activist and a pastor and a theologian, was also a poet. And he would write poems every year to honor leaders, and he would send them to the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier. And on February 20th, 1943, he submitted a poem that he could have never imagined would reverberate as it did. But he submitted a poem in which he said, I am a poet in Langston Hughes. I'm a creator of rhymes in Paul Laurence Dunbar. I'm a Christian statesman in J.R.E. Lee because I am somebody. I'm a soldier in Colonel Young. I'm courage in Crispus Attucks. I'm a contralto in Marian Anderson. I am somebody. I'm an insurance executive in A.G. Spalding, a biologist in Ernest Everett Just. I'm a historian in Carter G. Woodson. I'm a lover of education in Charlotte Hawkins Brown. I am somebody. I'm a scientist in George Washington Carver, an industrial educator in Booker T. Washington. I am somebody. I'm a trustee in slavery. I protected my master's wives and daughters while he fought to keep the chains of slavery about my body. And yet I am somebody. I'm a bishop in W.A. Fountain. I'm a ball of fire in Richard Allen. I'm a laborer in John Henry. I'm a Christian in Uncle Tom, for indeed I practice the religion of Jesus at points better than my master from whom I learned it. I am somebody. Dr. King would have been 14 years of age when he heard that poem. And prophetically and brilliantly, when Dr. William Holmes Boarder Sr. wrote that poem, he mentioned Uncle Tom the way that Uncle Tom used to be mentioned before the 60s. So often people use terms without reading the books from which the terms emerged, and anyone who's read Harriet Beecher Stowe's wonderful novel would know that Tom was the hero. That in fact, at the end of the novel, he gives his own life to protect someone else, but refuses to engage in violence. In fact, in the book, it was three other characters, Quimbo, Sambo, and Simon Legree, who were the villains. And yet that term would become a pejorative term for someone who was a traitor by the 1960s, because sometimes when individuals become so angry and emotional that they do not stop to think and read, destruction is the result. But Dr. King was a product of a generation that read, that studied, and he was influenced by those who dared to think, to process, to organize, to structure not only their thoughts, but their hearts and their minds before they acted. We are all beneficiaries of that generation, beneficiaries of his work. And to this extent, Dr. William Holmes Boarder once wrote a letter to Dr. King in 1959 and said to him, "My dear Reverend King, may God continue to bless you as you reach higher heights. Your future is unlimited, for you have earned your PhD. You are beautifully married, humble and sweet. You have fruitful years before you. I have picked you for 3 outstanding positions among our race. I will risk my prophecy on that. May God bless you as you continue to grow." We may not know the name William Holmes Boarder Sr. as well as we know other names, and yet this particular pastor and theologian was deeply influential in informing and forming who Dr. King would be, the Dr. King that we would know, the Dr. King who organized and became the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And it would seem that in Dr. Holmes Boarder's being able to see who Dr. King would be as early as the age of 14, as early as the age of 25, that the words of George Washington Carver are true. For Dr. Carter said, and Dr. Carver prophetically said, "I believe that God will reveal everything to his people if we keep our hand in his." For as much as he was a scientist, he was a believer. And if anything is true in 2024 and the years and decades going forward, in order to take action, things must be revealed to us. And God reveals things to his people when they keep their hand in his hand. God reveals things to his people whenever they dare to look back and say, how did we end up where we are? Someone bled, someone died, someone sacrificed, someone worked, someone was up while I was asleep, someone woke up before I woke up and kept working even when I went to bed so that I could be where I am. Let me carry on their legacy. And so in that sense, as I said, I don't want to hold you long, but I am a Baptist. Last year I closed 4 times. I promise I'm only going to close twice this time. And as I close for my first time, and as I come to this closing, I must express with pride that it is not my degrees and any of my accomplishments that define me. It is who was around me and who worked that I could do those things. Yes. Because I am a beneficiary of growing up in the pickle capital of the world. I'm a beneficiary of growing up at the corner of Oliver and Johnson Street, walking down to S-Mart to get my Mountain Dews and taking them back to get 10 cents for the glass bottle. I'm a beneficiary of Mount Gilead and growing up in the Baptist church and growing up around Christians who believe. I'm a beneficiary of a mother, a father, a brother, and a sister who worked sometimes until their arthritis had completely overtaken their fingers and hands and could not move so that I could stay in school and earn the degrees that I have. We are all beneficiaries of parents who worked at the pickle plant, who worked at Burlington Coat Factory, who worked day and night, shift after shift, day after day, so that we can be where we are. We are all beneficiaries of praying people who prayed for us and prayed our way through school and prayed our way into a job and prayed our way to where we are. We are beneficiaries of teachers who cared about their students, beneficiaries of communities. Whenever communities would raise each child as if each child was their own, we're beneficiaries of principals like Dr. Durant. We're beneficiaries of baccalaureate speakers like Dr. Grady Davis. We're beneficiaries of those who never put themselves first but always put us ahead of them so that we could get ahead. We're beneficiaries of individuals whose names may not be as well known as others, but it does not mean that their work was not twice as valuable as anyone else's. We are beneficiaries. Just as Dr. King was a beneficiary of Dr. Wendell Holmes' Borders, we're all beneficiaries of Dr. King's dream. We're beneficiaries of his dream that we would not have to live a certain nightmare. We're beneficiaries of his bloodshed on April 4th in 1968 on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. We're beneficiaries of his being willing to give his life so that our lives will be that much more uplifted and fulfilled. Yes, we're beneficiaries of his bloodshed. And as I come down to my second close and my final close here, I can't help but to contemplate that when I think about our being a beneficiary by way of someone's bloodshed, there's someone else who comes to mind. Amen. His name escapes me at the moment, but I can't help but to think about someone whose bloodshed has benefited all of us. If I start to think about it, this person, in fact, whose bloodshed benefited us, himself was a beneficiary. He was a beneficiary of a man named Abraham. And Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac was a beneficiary of Abraham. And then Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob was a beneficiary of Isaac, and Jacob had 12 sons. And one of those sons was named Judah, and he married a woman named Tamar, and they had 2 children, Peretz and Zerah, and then Peretz was a beneficiary of Judah. And then Peretz went out and had a son named Hezron, and Hezron was a beneficiary of Peretz. And that means Aram was a beneficiary of Hezron, and Aminadab was a beneficiary of Aram. That also means that Salmon was a beneficiary of Nahshon, and Salmon went out and married a woman named Rahab, and they had a son named Boaz, and Boaz was a beneficiary of Salmon. Now Salmon went out one day and met a Moabitess named Ruth, and they got together and had a son named Obed, and Obed was a beneficiary of Boaz and Ruth. And then Obed moved down to a place called Bethlehem and had a son named Jesse, and Jesse was a beneficiary of Obed. Then Jesse had 8 sons. The oldest was named Eliab, the youngest was named David, and David was a beneficiary of Jesse. And this means that David had a lot of sons, but the youngest was named Solomon, and Solomon was a beneficiary of David, which means that Rehoboam was a beneficiary of Solomon, which means that Abijah was a beneficiary of Rehoboam, and Asaph was a beneficiary of Abijah. That means Jehoshaphat was a beneficiary of Abijah, and that also means that Joram was a beneficiary of Jehoshaphat. That means Uzziah was a beneficiary of Joram. That means Jotham was a beneficiary of Uzziah. That also means that by the time we get to Jotham, Jotham had a son whose name was Ahaz. And Ahaz, or we call him Ahaz in the black church, but Ahaz for any scholars who are out there. But his son was named Hezekiah. And then Hezekiah then went on and benefited by way of Manasseh. Then Manasseh went on and benefited by way of having a son named Ammon. Ammon then was the father of Josiah. Josiah benefited from Ammon, and Josiah had a son named Jeconiah. Jeconiah all tried to benefit, but they went into Babylon for 70 years. But after 70 years in Babylon, Shealtiel benefited from Jeconiah, which means Zerubbabel benefited from Shealtiel, which means that Abiud benefited from Zerubbabel, which also means that Eliakim benefited from Abiud, which means that Azar benefited from Eliakim, which means that Zadok benefited from Azor, which means that Abiud benefited from Zadok, which means that Eliud benefited from Azor, which also means that Eleazar benefited from Abiud, which means that Mathan benefited from Eliud. That means that Jacob benefited from Mathan, that Joseph benefited from that Jacob. This is a different Joseph. This Joseph went out and met a woman named Mary. Joseph and Mary got together, had a son named Jesus. Jesus went to the cross. Whenever he bleeds and dies, we all become beneficiaries of him. We are all beneficiaries of the Lord. From Calypso to Kenya, we are all beneficiaries. From Maranatha to Mozambique, we're all beneficiaries. From Brazil Avenue to Brazil and South America, we're all beneficiaries. May all of God's people say amen. Amen.